Ladies and gentlemen, as well as any hybrids or alternatives to those ancient oversimplifications, hi there. I'm Eddie, your shipboard computer, and you're listening to, or watching, or etherically absorbing the Integral Stages author series for the third of our seemingly interminable reviews of the book First Principles and Values, 42 Propositions on Cosmoerotic Humanism, the Meta-Crisis, and the World to Come. A lurid tale of international intrigue and the Tao of the intrinsic value fields. Last time we tried to narrow our focus by diving just into a chapter on the various forms of alienation, but those are such loaded topics, so prone to lush nuances, so enfolded with insights from across the disciplinary spectrum that we only got halfway through. So here to further unpack the menagerie of alienations are a couple of anthro-ontologists and senior knights of the Order of the David J. Templars, Marc Gafni and Zach Stein. Hi, fellas.
Hey, it's good to see you. It's good to see you. And there is perhaps one important issue before we start, Zach, which is, do you have any comment on Layman's new haircut? Which I'm just, yeah,
I like it.
it's kind of, yeah, yeah, it's kind of to remember, right? Got a little drama there, right?
It's transitional. My goal is to have it come up like this,
But
but I've
you
sort
said
of got to
you're
start by just shaving the sides.
but what did you say? You're transitioning? I'm sorry, I didn't get it. What was
Yeah,
that?
I'm transitioning. This is
I
this is
got it. Okay.
transitional hair. It
Gumby.
was
He's turning into Gumby.
yeah, the hair feels like it belongs to a different body.
Like the
I
kid is
understand. Got it. Okay. Now we got that. We got that. At least we've addressed it at least. So take it away.
Okay. Last time we ended off discussing alienation from time, and I think a little bit of alienation from narrative. I know you guys have a lot of thoughts about the role of story, but I'm curious whether you think human beings are alienated from each other because we lack a shared narrative, or because we are altogether too susceptible to narratives, leading us to get hacked by all kinds of stories and storytellers. Are people today insufficiently or excessively saturated in narrative, or are those somehow the same thing?
So, and actually, Zach and I talked a little bit before, so I'm going to try and it's great. That's a great place to start, Layman, and thank you. And it's now about 4:20 East Coast time. So I think what we'll try and do is kind of, each talk for just, a few minutes on it and then pass it back. And of course, feel free to interrupt and try and kind of just create a kind of congruence of thoughts that perhaps will come together. So that is such an incredibly important place to start. So let me just try and just restate it and then just address it briefly. So, one of the things that people, say is, wow, God, I'm tired of hearing about this news story. But actually, we shouldn't be tired of hearing about a news story because we're not talking about a news story in the postmodern sense of endless narratives and endless stories, right? Which in the end become forms of pseudo identity because they make no pretense of being backed by the universe. They actually say they're made up, they're contrived, they are fictions, figments of our imagination, and social constructs, to cite one famous parrot of that postmodern moment. So from that perspective, story simply is, if it's successful, if you have a successful propaganda effort, and Zach spends some real time kind of writing and thinking about propaganda, if you have a successful propaganda effort, then, you will, in some deep and profound sense, be able to share your story right into the world. But if you have an unsuccessful propaganda effort, or if you live in a world in which propaganda is no longer effective, right, then trying to claim and impose your narrative will inevitably and appropriately cause polarization. We're saying something entirely different. We're saying that underneath all of the diverse stories, there's a shared plot line of reality. And that plot line is the inherent structure of reality, desiring ever more value, ever more eros, ever more intimacy, ever more uniqueness, right? We've tried to articulate that story. And story itself, the notion of a shared story, that we have first principles and first values that are backed by the universe, that are embedded in what's generally a kind of meta story of reality as a context for our diversity, right, is the nature of reality, right? And so it's of course true that reality is not merely stories, reality is also atoms, but atoms are also stories. And that's critical. An atom is a story. An atom is very particularly, right, a result of a causal set of events driven by desire, right, which create a new whole, right, a new value. That's called an atom, which has new vectors of attention and new possibilities of being recognized in recognition, right? And there's even, as Stuart Kaufman reminds us, or Richard Feynman reminds us, or Abhinavagupta reminds us, or Abraham Cook reminds us, there's even a proto-interiority at the level of an atom. Or Whitehead reminds us when he talks about prehension, there's a proto-freedom, there's a freedom, there's a plot line, there's desire, and there's desire for value, right? Even at the level of an atom, and then those stories evolve. So with that in mind, right, kind of 4 minutes in, and I'll conclude it here, right? With that in mind, what we're saying is actually elemental and self-evident, which is, right, once you actually do the work, which is actually reality is not really a fact, reality is a story. And it's not an ordinary story, right? It's actually a story of eros value. And that story of eros value is the context for our diversity. Once that's true, then stories become not homogenizing. It's not the ministry of love and an Orwellian nightmare, right? It's not, on the other hand, right, there's no story, right? It's not the claim of story not having any ontology and all stories are just made up. No. There's the obvious, what's obviously true, right? We live in a universe which is a universe. It's a uni story, right? There's an omnicoherence to reality. We live in an omnicoherent reality. That's what we mean by an intimate universe. And that omnicoherent reality generates multiple stories, but they're all part of, instruments of, a larger shared story of value. Okay, that's the 5 minutes I promised. 5, and I just turn it to, and I want to be just kind of actually sensitive to time so we don't, because we could run off on any of these. So I want to just give like a 5-minute take on that and turn to Dr. Stein.
Thank you. Let's see. So first, yes, there's a lot of things going around that are story-like, and they're stories, right? The media, movies, television shows, Netflix. Netflix is an endless world of stories. I think one of the ways into what we're doing is to think about how do we have a conversation about which are good and bad stories and which are true and false stories. Or many people debate the facts, but in fact we know that facts out of context tell the wrong story. So we're not really concerned about the facts, we're concerned about what's the true story. Right? And so this question of how would you distinguish between a true story and a story that's made up? Do we have the cultural resources to do that? And I think the situation we're in right now is that we've given up on the idea that we could come together and agree on a story that's true about the world. And so that's why we're so interested in all these stories that aren't true. In one way. We're also interested because we're addicted to them. We're addicted to the distraction of them, and the instruments by which they're delivered to us are designed to be addictive. And they're full of hyperstimulation and a whole bunch of other things that drive you to want to consume more of this, and then make you unable to distinguish between what of this is valuable and what of this is not valuable, what of this is good and what of this is actually bad. And so I think the consumption of stories that are bad for people, which is to say false and ugly/wrong, mean telling the wrong story about reality, telling the wrong story about personhood, exposing you to violence, exposing you to hyperstimuli, um, not displaying virtue, value, etc. Uh, the overconsumption of those is, um, stultifying, numbing, desensitizing, forces derealization. Uh, and so I think that's a big part of what we're concerned about in a sense with the second book that's coming, Techno-Feudalism, which David is kind of fiercely working on, asking this question of kind of like, do we even have the conditions, the technical kind of like communications technologies conditions for the possibility of sharing a story about what's true? Or are we actually somehow very much in the situation of being really unable to do that in a sense for structural, like technological structural reasons, as much as for political reasons and neurological reasons, or whatever the reasons would be that people live in different stories about reality. And so, yes, and as Mark was saying, the notion that we're trying to tell the story that has always been being told by the universe. We're trying to participate in the telling of that story that's always been being told by the universe, rather than tell some arbitrary story. And so that's a more complex task, but one of the tasks that humans have long taken on for themselves. That's why we call it a neo-perennialism or an evolving perennialism, is this notion of like, how do we tell that story? And actually, the stories we tell reflect cosmic value, so that when you're consuming a story, you leave the telling of it bettered. Like you leave the telling of it better off, more informed about reality, closer to reality, rather than leaving the story feeling, worse about reality. And in one sense, it's a simple sense, because you could feel worse because you've been literally had your brain tortured by overstimulation for an hour and a half. Meaning like hyper fast cuts and too much sound and hyperstimuli and graphic violence and from 1,000 impossible inhuman angles. And then you leave the theater and you're feeling something. What's the aftertaste of whether the story is a good story to have absorbed into you? So yeah, I like that line of inquiry. And when we say new story, and specifically when we say new story of first principles and first values,
Right.
what we're talking about is something very profoundly different. And story, in a sense, maybe trivializes it, but actually, no, we're kind of reclaiming the depth of that word in a kind of deep anthropocentric and cosmogenetic sense, meaning that the arc of cosmic evolution is best understood as a story expressing itself. Not we can understand it as a story, that
Right.
it's a story, that our understanding of it as a story is accurate, more accurate than understanding it as a disconnected, randomly augmenting computational engine or something like that, which is by definition not part of a story or able to understand the story. So those are some initial thoughts, kind of like moving from what Mark said. And so yeah, but a deep inquiry. And again, I think one of the concerns that David has is just, to what extent can we tell these stories that are true? Like, who hears them? What are the medium by which they're propagated? Which books can be received as actually a book that's saying something, rather than a book that's just part of the churn? And so David, has been working on that.
Yeah, that's a
So it's not alienation from story per se, it's alienation from true story, cosmic story, story of value. It's a failure of the congruence of reality as story to the social story that we're telling. And I would say the argument that you can't tell a true story because telling stories are based in values is defeated by a deeper understanding of the architecture, how value operates. But I'm really curious, Zach, you were talking about things like quick cuts. And there's a question here in terms of the alienation from story, how much of it is the content of the story and how much is the style of the storytelling? Or if you had a really good story and really good sort of first principles underlining it, does the medium and the style of the storytelling still cause alienation if it's done in certain ways?
Of course. I mean, the medium is the message to some extent. So, for example, if you have a long duration multi-series Netflix thing, which is kind of a bunch of independent little stories, the lack of an overarching story arc is an interesting characteristic. So it's not like one of the great myths, which has sub-stories, but then has an overarching conclusion. It's going based on consumer use habits, whether people continue to view, so they augment the story. Oh, people like this actor on it, and so they don't like that one, so we fire that one, we bring someone else on. Well, look, we're getting more views, and so they're changing the story. And so the driving force for the telling of the story is not sharing value in the culture or something like that. It is making money. And so the stories will get you to watch them anyway possible, and some of the lack of access even to the ability to pay attention to a good story, which usually requires some telling, like some long duration joint attentional situation to be telling a story. The inability to even do that sometimes follows from just the watching of the short duration little thing where, oh, commercial break means we have to kind of wrap this thing. Oh, now we're back from commercial means we started the thing again. So the fragmentation of attention by design in the thing itself denudes the complexity, makes the value, even when it is there, harder to detect, harder to retain. And then, of course, the alienation and this notion of the connection between alienation from value, alienation from story, leading to X risk, is the core of
Everything.
the book. And so, to the extent that media draws us farther away from cultures that can respond to the meta crisis, which is to say, alienated from reality, cultures that alienate us from reality. It's bad news. So I'm into storytelling and propagation of stories to the extent that they bring us closer to reality, which would be the telling of stories that are adequate to the historical moment to galvanize people to value, to recognize and feel the value.
I mean, it's totally picking up from Zach. It's worth it's worth double clicking here, in this story before we leave it behind. So let's just say it very clearly. Story is an ontology of reality. And that story is not something that appears as a social structure at the human level, which is a mechanical coincidence of reality, right? As many historians, right, depict it. Story is an ontology of reality. And one of the ways, that reality discloses that it's in one of its most essential ways is through story and number. The ancient book called the Book of Creation, which is this 450, 45, whatever it is, word document, which originates a certain dimension of the Solomon tradition, is that reality is grounded in story and number. But story and number are the same word. They're the same root word, mispar and sipur. And they lead to a word which is sapphire, which is the illumination of reality, and sefer, which is the text of reality. And what this text is pointing towards is that the very grounding of reality is story, so that if you're not rooted in an accurate story, right, then you will actually feel alienated. And I'm not separate from that story. So let's just say it very directly. I'm not separate from the story of reality. I'm participatory in the story of reality. So the story of reality has a coherence, and that coherence lives in me. So when we say I participate in the intimate universe, we say, okay, I live in the intimate universe, but no, I don't just live in the intimate universe. The intimate universe lives in me. And I remember a beautiful conversation. I was walking in Tuscany back in 2012-13 with Irvin Laszlo. And I was talking about this notion of intimacy. And we talked about then, we coined a term coherent intimacy or intimate coherence, right? There's a coherent intimacy. There's an intimate coherence that goes all the way up and all the way down. And that is what Zach and I are talking about. That is the storyline of reality. So I live in it. It lives in me. To be in denial, when I live in denial of my essential reality, I pathologize. That's what pathology means. Pathology means I'm telling a lie about my true nature. I'm telling a lie about the story of who I am. I'm lying, right, about my essential nature and the nature of the reality that I live in. And I feel that lie. That lie actually is devastating to me, right? And, a very beautiful 100 pages, probably the most beautiful 100 pages that Scott Peck wrote back in the early 70s is the first 100 pages of his book, People of the Lie. And he's talking there about an extreme version of that expression, but it's basically the essence of People of the Lie is this violation of story. When I'm telling a story that's fundamentally not true, right? That's in violation of the inherent structure of reality, right? And the inherent structure of reality is a story of value. So that's just kind of one, and it's worth just kind of feeling that and saying that. Now, the second thing, and Zach, you were, Zach was pointing to this, just in a kind of bracket in between is, we'll just put a word on the table. What's the aftertaste of experiencing a story and hearing a story? What's the aftertaste? And one of the things that, Luria says in the 16th century he cites the text from Exodus, we'll see God from behind. Moses wants to see God, and God says, I don't think so, but I'll let you see me from behind. So the word behind is achor, after. So if you read Luria carefully, he says, we actually experience the ontology of something. Is it ontology or is it superficial? Is it pseudo? Based on the aftertaste, right? And it's cheap food, good in the moment, but bad aftertaste, right? Inappropriate sexing, wrong person, wrong time, right? Might be okay in the moment, but not a good aftertaste. Stories leave an aftertaste. So I'll just give you three simple examples. One, we'll just name them. Reading Yuval Harari's book, Sapiens, leaves a very bad aftertaste. It's a chilling experience because the claim being made is that it's all made up. There's no essential story being told. We make up stories. And he actually does all of matter and life in 2 paragraphs on the first page, right? And then it jumps to the human world where they're making up stories. Literally, that's the structure of the book, right? Right. And then in his book, 21 Questions, he says, chapter 1, we need a new story. And then the last 2 chapters, but if you're a good Buddhist or Vipassana meditator, you realize stories just made up. It's not real. There's no actual real story. There's no storyline. So this moment, and again, he's not speaking as a philosopher. He's speaking. That's why he's not important as a philosopher. He's an uncontaminated kind of natural parroting, kind of the reigning metaphors of Hebrew University, right? Which are the kind of classical postmodern moment. So reading Sapiens leaves a bad aftertaste. And I'll just give you a last example and turn back to you, and you'll take us in the next direction. But a movie like Barbie, they had to make up an Oscar. We're in 2024 now. They had to make up an Oscar, right, to give Barbie because it kind of went nuts at the box office. But when Noah and Greta were sitting on the Upper East Side, kind of, typing out the movie, but they basically told us a story. And the basic story was there is no story. There's no love story. Barbie doesn't love Ken and Ken doesn't love Barbie. And of course, if you watch the movie carefully, which we're not going to talk about now, we've talked about that a lot because it's a cultural text. The point is not this Barbie doesn't love this Ken. Barbie and Ken are archetypes. There is no love story. There is no love story between Barbie and Ken, period. It doesn't exist, right? It all ends when you die, meaning's complete contrived, right? As Ruth Mattel, right, kind of says to Barbie in a particular scene. And the aftertaste, as Zach was pointing to, when you walk out of Barbie, and I must have talked to several dozen people, right, who walk out of Barbie and you feel like violated. And so you're not sure what you're just, right? It's like, oh, my very essential sense of a meaningful cosmos, which I engage in every single day, is violated dogmatically. Okay, so that's just a sense. I think we've talked a little bit about story, and we've done a couple of takes on it. I hope that clarified something in this story. Sure. We're trying to tell.
Let's talk a little bit about mutual political alienation. We're currently in an age that's extremely polarized, although we're also told it's extremely polarized, so that's sometimes hard to believe. But the whole situation puts me in mind of, Zach mentioned medium as the message, puts me in mind of Marshall McLuhan's speculation that in an age where speed and network transmission of information break down the old boundaries of time, space, and identity, people become fuzzy about who they feel they are, and they revert back to very simple forms of reestablishing identity, which is basically conflict. It's an attempt to make a boundary for the self, to push against something, schismogenesis. So the question that comes up for me around political alienation is basically like, are people polarized as a side effect of being trapped in information cul-de-sacs and being enmeshed in political in-group dynamics that end up alienating the other? Or at some level, are we actively trying to get this feeling of conflict, deliberately, if perhaps subconsciously, looking for enemies as a way to generate a visceral sense of having some kind of group identity? Which way does the causality go, is how I enter this question.
Zach, you want to kick it off? Take it away.
Yeah, so the rooting political polarization in the polarization of values, which are themselves taken out of the field of value, is kind of the argument of the book. And it's an argument that builds from the idea that if you are telling a coherent story of value based on a grammar of value that's legible to a bunch of people, then you are kind of in a situation, you're in a better situation for being able to deal with conflicting values when they come up in your culture, because you can say, actually, we have a story that includes both of those values as important. Bigger than both of those values is this ability to have a coherent story about all the values, which waxes and wanes and is complex. Right? It's not a coherent architectonic meta theory of value. Nope. It's a coherent story of value, because values are in conflict. They shade, they move, they're unique. There's all of these things. So I think that's very key, which is that the value emerges as a kind of idolatrous, as it's been kind of like evacuated from the broader field. It's like it pops up and then you idolize this one thing, and then that becomes all the only stories you tell her about this thing. And you're like, dude, that's a really weird story, right? Because there's so many other stories. Like, to tell that thing you were concerned about, whatever your issue is, whatever this value you've taken out of account, to really tell that story, you have to tell about the whole field. But you're not. You're just telling about this really weird disconnected thing in a way that makes you hate those people and be hated by them. And so the alienation from the field of value, alienation of different values from each other, because they're out of the story that includes both of them. That's the problem. It's a deep problem. And so, like for example, in the myth we tell about America, the idea was that there was a shared enough story of value in the civic religion that we could actually disagree and yet still be on the same team. Right? That famous scene in Lincoln, where it's like, I disagree with you, but I would die for your right to be able to say what you say. And that's an example of, like, you're committed to the field of value rather than to a particular value that's taken out of context. And so that's very, very cool. So as much as this philosophical conversation about neoperennialism, all this stuff seems far away from the concrete context of political polarization in which people, are enraptured and entertained, which is the medium is the message thing, which I'm not doing. The thing I'm doing is that, actually, one of the reasons they're so entertained is because they're not realizing there is a possibly coherent story to tell in which these conflicting views can be held in tension, and we can cooperate around their mutual instantiation, rather than the only hypothesis as a radical enemy hypothesis, which is that you hold that value because you're evil, or some extreme emotional splitting due to the inability to access the deeper story, where that someone could sensibly hold such a view. So that's a little bit of that. So the book, I think, does some good explaining of that.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, we got a note in Layman. You might have to edit this out. Certain things, have kind of mystical significance you can't really talk about. But we got a note under the door. I can't tell you exactly how it all happened, but it was 2016 late. It was from David. And David said in this note, it was very short and it was a little cryptic, but the part of it I can share is he said, stop talking about values. People have to stop talking about values and start talking about a field of value. So this phrase that he shared with us, this field of value, right, is very important. And it's a critical phrase because field of value is an intentional weaving of language which stands against the values wars, the wars about values. And so let's see if we can kind of just amplify and play with a couple of things, in resonance with Z that will actually kind of address and kind of, deepen us one more stage in your inquiry, which is so beautiful. First, let's just go super crazy simple. You go for lunch with someone, you don't have much to talk about. So what do people do? They talk about a third person, which is, of course, exactly what you're referring to. Let's make it just kind of very real and available, right? Since we don't have a common field of value, we don't have a common field of eros value between us. If I can use a word that we've, kind of used a lot this year and talk about in the book, this notion of eros value. We're not a shared field of eros value. We're not inside the circle, meaning the circle of eros value. So we place someone else outside the circle in order to give ourselves the illusion of being inside the circle. Right? And that dynamic, right, populates culture. We create a scapegoat, we create an enemy, we create an other to give ourselves the illusion of being in the field of eros value. So that's kind of one. But now let's kind of take it a step deeper. And again, playing with, these themes. So let's just play one note briefly because it's insanely helpful. If you look at levels of self carefully, and you look at levels of value and identity, you see that they match, they're resonant, they're coherent in a very beautiful way. So let's say separate self. So we have in cosmorotic humanism, we talk about the four selves. So separate self, right, is values as identity, pro-life, pro-choice, red state, blue state, whatever the form is. So my separate self means there's these values. I'm identified with these values. And of course, the separate self is in a natural state of war, which is why red states and blue states are in a state of war. And pro-life and pro-choice is in a state of war because I've identified with a particular value, as Zach was pointing to. And I say that value is the entire story of value. And I liberate that value from its essential inherent sacred love obligation to be in synergistic dance and relationship with other values, right? I free it, I liberate it from the field, I transform it into an absolute, and I worship at the idolatry of separate self, which is that separate value. Then we move into true self. Now, true self is the realization, not just that I'm in the field of awareness. That's the way the Buddhists usually tell the story. No. It's not. It's a wrong telling of true self. Not just in the field of consciousness. I'm in the field of consciousness and radical allurement and interconnectivity. Right. There's an interconnectivity that moves through the whole field. So now that sense of true self, and true self is always the singular that has no plural, and the total number of true selves is one. So that's the field of value. The true self is not about individuated separate selves. It's the field of true self. The singular that has no plural, that's the field of value. There's just value, right? There's no separate self values. There's just value. We're in the field of value. That's the field of true self. Then, just like I then, as we say in cosmorotic humanism, I then go to the personal beyond the impersonal. I individuate a higher individuation beyond the egoic structure, and I then realize unique self, uniqueness, irreducible uniqueness, not just social, cultural, and psychological conditioning, but an irreducible uniqueness. Now, on the value side, then out of the field of value, particular values, life, choice, individuate. But just like Zach and Mark and Layman are unique selves, but before that we're true selves. So therefore we can love each other, we can honor each other because we're in this field of value together. We're not in a separate self state of war. So in that same way, we can overcome the alienation between us and between individuated values. Right? Those individuated values actually talk to each other. They dance with each other. They synergize with each other. And all of a sudden, the clash between life and choice begins to actually melt away, and actually new options for wholeness emerge. And in fact, if you check the Brahmin tradition and you check the Orthodox Hebrew tradition, and you look at how they talk about, let's say, the pro-life, pro-choice abortion issues, they're not at all polarized. There's actually a very complex, beautiful relationship between these two sets of values that create new wholeness and new possibility. And finally, last one, evolutionary unique self, the fourth self. That's the realization that when we each play our note in the unique self symphony, new music is created. So when pro-life and pro-choice actually synergize, we're not just static, we are an evolving perennialism. It's an evolving Tao, right? The story gets deeper, right? We are those who tell the story in a deeper way. We're now an evolutionary unique self. We're now an emergent evolving value. So it's a very, we're now, Zach and I are just writing up this piece of it, for the anthro-ontology material, but it was very helpful for us when we realized actually that these two vectors actually precisely interlocking and overlapping and inter-included. So I hope that gives a little bit of a sense of it. And it's super helpful like that.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue from the political alienation to the alienation of values from each other. And what comes up for me around trying to de-alienate values is, yes, on the one hand, experience of a generalized field of value gives you an intuition about how to play better in the field of values and orient them together in a sense that they can be aligned somehow. But I think there's also a kind of an attitude and a practice around tolerating the friction between values that has to be undertaken in order to make yourself available for synergization. Right? It reminded me a little bit about the thing about aftertaste, because one of the tricky things with aftertaste is sometimes you don't know the aftertaste until the aftertaste the first time may not be the aftertaste after 4 or 5
You
viewings or
need the
readings of something.
aftertaste of the aftertaste. That's actually
Yeah.
true.
So
You actually need
you
to be
have
able
to
to
have a
cultivate
practice and an
discernment.
attitude where you're willing to sort of hang out in the affective cognitive
Yeah.
dissonance of it. So what is it, what's required of people to stand in the position between values such that through the person they can become more harmonized, more orchestrated, and less mutually alienating?
It's funny, Zach. You're going to take this one. We got into a thing because you talked twice, where you're now taking the question first. So I'm passing it to you first. So I don't mean to put you on the spot each time where you've got to take it first, but I don't want to go twice. So you take it first, and I'll go after.
Yeah.
Funny, that's sweet.
The answer to that is
Yes.
valueception. Valueception is the answer to that, basically, which is that the I am value with the absence of a refined anthro-ontological ability to do good discernment with the field of value, which is to say, experience with discernment concerning value. In the absence of that, it's painful. It's very painful to try to reconcile values, and so you stick to one or two that are easily reconcilable and believe the others actually are not values. That's the typical thing to do. So you, as you're saying, to really do it would be tension, but then beyond the tension, there's actually the paradox, almost like the humor of paradox or something like that, when you look at the intensity of polarity of this thing. But you have to move through that discomfort. People move through that discomfort, but the discomfort's very intense. And without the faith that there actually is a field of value, you would pull away from the discomfort and you would just go to holding one, and thereby demonizing a very large percentage of probably the rest of the field of value. So yes, that's one good answer, is that the better we educate into discernment concerning value. And that's one of the deeper thing about that a field of value exists, begins this conversation then about, okay, so we can make discernments within the field. It boosts this whole possibility of perceiving value. So that's the issue. But yes, it's confusing because they're legitimately different and legitimately co-primordial. So yeah, that would be one way.
Let's play with that a little bit.
Go
That's
for
why
it.
let's pick up one, Zach. I'll pick up one, one theme that you threw on the table, which is a great one, which is the humor, right? It's Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock, so let's be funny, right? The humor in it, right? And the humor is a big deal. So you have two values that are moving against each other. If you take humor out, if you take laughter out of the story, you get Umberto Eco's plot in The Name of the Rose, right? Where you have this rector who is poisoning people who go to the library and they take out Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and they turn to the page that's about humor and they're poisoned because he's poisoning the edge of the page. And that rector's point is there actually can't be any paradox. There can't be any dance. It's very, very clear. It's very, very binary, right? And any violation of that is a violation of the divine will. By contrast, you have this wonderful story about David, and at the center we're trying to integrate a new story of value as one expression.
Well,
Oh, I don't know what happened there.
lose Mark.
That was Mark. I don't know.
Apologize. That was funny. I got knocked off in a little joke in the middle of the thread. So I was saying that we do have a little bit of a unique relationship to the Wisdom of Solomon lineage and
Your
the
camera. Mark.
Say it again.
Camera.
And the
Camera's not on. There we go.
and the Wisdom of Solomon lineage is initiated by Judah, as in David J. Temple, Judah, right? And David is, of course, the father of Solomon, who enacts the temple. So, Zach was talking about the kind of the necessity for humor, what we're calling laughter. So laughter is this very beautiful quality. Laughter is the 12th of the 12 multisensory senses of perception, right? That's articulated in the lineage. And it's the 12th because it's the most profound of all of them. And a sense perception is something that allows you to hold reality and to see it, understand it, and disclose it. The eye of value, particularly, this kind of valueception, this kind of eye of value, right, in a new way. That's what laughter does. It allows you to nullify the kind of pomposities of reality and then to hold paradox. So David is called in the lineage, right, the jester of the king, right? And the 10-second version of the story is David says to God, he says, I got this covered. He says, test me. Naseni Adonai Naseni, test me. And God says, that's not a good idea. And David says, no, I got this. Test me, do anything. So, of course, we go to Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah, the first verse, and which records what happened when David said, test me. He goes up and sees her bathing on the roof, and the whole kingdom goes insane, right? He has Bathsheba is bathing on the roof. He has Uriah killed, right? He sleeps with Bathsheba, takes her as his wife in a complex story. They birth Solomon, but actually it's the beginning of the end of David's ability to hold a dynasty. In the last 8 chapters of the book of Kings is a disaster with Absalom rebelling and sons being killed. And, it all goes bad. So God says to David, he says, in this passage in the Zohar, it's 97a, God says, I told you not to do this. And David says to God, he says, what do you mean? He says, translating generally from the Aramaic, he says, you're the master, I'm the student, I was respectful, so I let the master win. So he tells God a joke, essentially. So what's it a joke about? What's he joking about? He's joking about this huge issue. Do we have freedom or don't we? He's joking about this thing, right? He's trying to hold, right, in paradox, right, the dialectical play, right, of antecedent causation, right, and radical freedom, which you can only hold in paradox. And the inability of people like Sapolsky, for example, I was just reading through his book. We just published his book on free will, which kind of echoes the classical free will position that's been popularized by people like Sam, right, Sam Harris, right, is the utter inability to hold paradox. And to hold the paradox, right, of these two clear values, which is yesterday determines today, and there's this originating force in today, right, which is not subject to antecedent causation. this irreducible new emergence. But holding that paradox, right, requires something. It requires me not resolving a part of the field of value and ignoring an obvious other part. So that ability that Zach was pointing to actually hold paradox, the laughter that holds paradox. David, right, the kind of initiator of the lineage, right, is about laughter that holds that paradox. And that allows for alienation to begin to, we can laugh with each other, right? There's a wider field that we're in together. We can begin to hold each other, and that field is a field of value.
Putting together this idea of the paradox of values playing off each other and this notion of value discernment, I become curious about trying to discern which values we're looking to establish the complementarity of, because uh, I wonder how much people are alienated from knowledge of their own values and other people's values. And what I mean is, like, we have this sociolinguistic mind, which has an interesting feature of making up aspirational and social values we can tell other people, and that's not quite the same as a description of the values that are implied by our behavior. So I tell myself I'm criticizing someone's lies because I value honesty. It's possible I actually value any excuse to disparage others. Or, sort of, what do we make of people who say they're voting for Trump because of their Christian values when he's so notably anti-Christian in most of his slouching toward Bethlehem that it seems hilarious to even say that? All right, obviously we could say they're voting for him as a protest against liberal postmodernism or something, but it's at least possible that those voters don't actually hold the values they claim to hold. So the having and the declaring of values are distinct processes, not necessarily correlated to each other. And could we fall into a trap of addressing the alienation between declared values rather than between embodied values? Anyone?
I'll keep going for it. That's fine. That's fine. Let's see. I mean, there's a lot to say. So there's the values you actually hold. There's the values you actually, meaning the ones you think about if you were to write in your journal or something. And then there's the values you tell people you hold. And then there's the values that actually shape your behavior. Those don't all necessarily have to go together. We are often talking about the values that you perceive, the values that pre-exist you, the values that exist in you that are inextricable. So part of the ontologizing of value is moving the conversation of value from the domain of belief you hold, belief you tell people, belief you act on, where value is actually an internal state. We're saying, no, actually value is part of the universe, which means that holding a value is like literally like you're holding something. Is it real or not? Like, how many things can you? So there's a way in which the way to even get out of that conversation, which is in a sense what the psychoanalytic tradition was trying to do with the kind of pseudo declaration of value, shaping pseudo identity, which is undermined by actual commitment to value, which creates a Freudian slip or some other, borderline or deeply kind of psychopathic reaction or so, yeah. So, but the broader point here is that it is the case that if you don't have a way to think about the ontology of value, which is to say to move from the discourse of believing versus saying versus acting on value, as opposed to the discourse of perceiving, knowing, sharing joint attention about, as if external, which is to say embodied in the universe, it allows for a way to actually get out of that, because then you can talk about something that's real, which is what Freud is trying to get to. It's like, oh, no, wait, there's actually something, which is, for example, you need to drink, you need to eat. Right? Oh, you could say you don't poop. Like, people think that about themselves or whatever. Like, and it's like, no, actually, there's this whole oral and anal phase where you figure out the whole pooping thing and bring self-awareness to it. And so he points to this structure, and it's quite crude, but he's pointing to the one that would be accepted by materialist biologists, which is that there's a drive in there, which is if you clarify value, the base of the whole stack of your own values, which is what really matters to you, what is the universe intrinsically embodying in you a desire to have, not because it's arbitrary, because it's actually part of the structure of the universe for you to have that. And so yes, the clarification, this leads to the clarification of desire, which is, I'll hand over to Mark to speak to, but it is important to get that the way we usually speak about values is that they are held, spoken about, acted on. And a lot of the way we're trying to switch into speaking about value with anthropontology and cosmologic humanism is that actually there's a ontological or a alethic discourse about value, which is to say a discourse that is a truth statement discourse about value, not a discourse that concerns preferences and internal states. And so it's a different type of modal vocabulary. You could also call it a normative vocabulary, which would be a non-arbitrary, discursive, reality-related part of you, which is the I of value. So that's, without that, becomes hard to even make that distinction. What's my real value? What's my fake value? The value I act on, then like you can't, because what is value? It's just some weird set of preferences, in which case, I don't have some deeper set. I'm just switching between them because the context is switching. There's no such thing as a deeper value I'm actually committed to, for example. So that would be a view. So you have to have some minimal realism about value to even engage in something like therapy or something like the work of clarifying what actually matters to you. And the deeper things that would allow you to have coherence between stated, believed, and acted upon value, which is, of course, important because you have that often with your relation to physical reality. So imagine you had some story about physical reality that you told yourself that you didn't tell other people, which was actually wrong about physical reality. Like, how would that go for you? That'd be weird. You'd be secretly disagreeing about people with people about the physical universe. Or if you took some physical law out of context of the other physical laws. No, I only actually believe in the law of gravity, but I don't believe, like, come on, that's crazy, right? So it's like we're willing to have coherence in our discourse and reality relatedness of our discourse. So you would say, oh, hey, man, he acts one way in terms of his belief about gravity, but he really actually probably doesn't believe in gravity. I don't think so. I bet he actually really. So we're willing to entertain that there's this coherence that's possible with regard to those truths, but with value, because we exploded the ontology, we don't have that same ability to even get into the clarification of desire as a conversation.
That's excellent, right? So if you think about it, let's pick up from there. So that's what we were referring to when we talked earlier about this Solomonic lineage understanding of these two words that share the same root, which means they participate in the same field, which are number and story. And essentially what we're saying is that a mathematical value, which is disclosed through anthropontology, which is telling a story. So in other words, numbers are telling a story. Right? Numbers are actually, there's not actually a radical split between number and story. They participate in the same root. Numbers are telling a very particular story of the universe in which there's electromagnetism and there's gravitational forces and there's the strong and the weak nuclear and there's Higgs boson fields that without which atoms don't exist, right, et cetera, et cetera. And knowing the truth, right? So Steven Weinberg says, I'm going to rebel against everything they told me in my local synagogue about value because that seemed pretty pre-modern and antiquarian. And Steven Weinberg got that right. And he says, I'm going to focus on muons. And I'm going to know every truth about muons that ever existed in the world, right? And he's driven by this passionate desire to know the truth of muons, right, as this ultimate value that animates and drives his entire life. So there's this, and there's this realization that, of course, he won the Nobel Prize for it. There's this realization that mathematical value is telling a story, and the value of what we're calling interior science equations, right, are telling a story. And that without those interior science equations, we're actually not living in reality. We're living in denial of something which is essential, which causes the pathological breakdown of reality, much the same way if we ignore core physical constants. Now, The physical constants of reality don't tell us necessarily everything about the kind of world we should build, but we do know that whatever world we build, right, needs to be aligned with those physical constants or it's going to collapse. So that's why we always say, we kind of have and we share with kind of people that are kind of talking to us or studying with us or working with us in this work, that we never want to use words like universal grammar of value unless we add the second phrase, which is as a context for our diversity. It's a universal, and there's no contradiction between those two. There's a universal grammar of value as a context for our diversity. So that's kind of 1 and 2. But 3 is really important. So now, what's the relationship between irreducible uniqueness, which means that there are actually distinctions in value, because the way we're understanding in cosmologic humanism unique self, which is kind of part of these 4 selves, which are so core to this world religion as a context for diversity, is that the unique self, remember, is the individuated expression of true self. So true self is the field of value. Unique self is, I'm a unique incarnation of value. Back in the day when I was, sharing and talking to Ken and, about unique self, we talked about unique self as unique perspective, irreducibly unique perspective. And we did a whole integral theory journal, about that. But as the years have gone on, right, there's been a deeper realization that uniqueness is this unique quality of intimacy, which is a value of cosmos. And that actually my uniqueness is my unique configuration of desire. And desire is always a desire for value. So uniqueness actually becomes my unique incarnation of value. Now, let's make this kind of very real for a moment. So that means that Layman and Marc and Zach are all 3 of us in the field of value, right? This holy trinity, right, in the field of value. And yet we are unique incarnations of value. Okay, no wisecracks about unholy trinity. I can hear them coming. Okay, right. We're unique incarnations of value, right? In other words, meaning the eye of value refracted through the prism of laymanness will disclose something of value that Zach and Marc won't quite see, right? We're not redundant to each other, which is why we can be symphonic to each other, which is why we can create new synergies and new possibilities, and why our irreducibly unique instruments are needed, right, to evolve value. And it's very, very beautiful. Now, the lineage, right, spoke very beautifully about a person having a unique relationship to a particular mitzvah. And mitzvah means literally commandment, but actually it also means in Aramaic, that which you're intimate with, or the value you're intimate with. So Zach might be intimate with a particular quality of value that I can talk about cognitively, but Zach has a closer intimacy to, or I might be intimate with a dimensions of a field of value that I have a unique quality, I have an ability to feel them, or Layman, and on and on. So I'm a unique incarnation of value, or let me say it slightly differently, and this is a core terminus technis in cosmologic humanism. I'm a unique script of desire, right? Reality is scripts of desire. I'm a unique script of desire, and clarified desire yields clarified value, right? And so I'm actually a unique script of value. And when we say that I have a unique letter in the cosmic scroll, we're saying I'm a unique text of value who both is in the cosmic scroll, which is the shared field of value, and yet I'm an irreducibly unique expression of value. And all of a sudden, I'm welcome in the universe. This is so basic. We're not engaged here in abstract philosophy and just kind of wasting our time in kind of a belabored, kind of postmodern intellectual onanism, right? You actually can't be welcome in the universe without this. If I don't incarnate a unique dimension of value, which contributes to the field of value, what am I doing here? I'm redundant. Right. So that's the notion of irreducible uniqueness is irreducible value, but not just irreducible value in the sense of quantitative. It's not just quantitative. No, I'm literally a unique quality of value. Right. And if there's nothing Marc can do to participate in the Zachness of value, it can't be done. Now, we'll have a shared field. That's why we can talk to each other. That's why we can create together. Right. So we're in a common field of value. What we share, what's unique about us is, however, right, that which emerges from the field and is irreducibly unique. And so it would make sense that there is appropriate polemic, appropriate diversity, appropriate discussion, right? We should have, right? And the description, last sentence, the description of the study hall in the lineage is that the study partners engage in fierce contestation, right? And it looks like they're literally about to murder each other. And then they finish the study and they walk out arm in arm, right? Embraced, right, from the study hall, because they're participating, right, in the same field of value. So it's critical. And that allows us to actually embrace irreducible uniqueness and the irreducible unique story of value that discloses my unique contribution that's needed by reality, even as we participate in the same field. So now we have, now we can actually be welcome in the universe. Now we can actually raise our children, right, to feel like they're needed, not as a construct, but as their essential nature. That changes everything in education and in everything else. Like that.
So the story of value is a lot closer to science than a lot of people would think from hearing the word story and the words
Yes,
value.
exactly.
And then all of that's enacted as a diversely intimate, non-redundant valueception.
Yes. I have value.
Let's pick up on this the sapphire of numbers and explore economics. Because one of the most pertinent forms of alienation for a lot of people operates around the externalities of the market economy. We've had this idea for a couple hundred years, really interesting idea that we could set up a collective intelligence that consists of price-based transactions between self-serving rational interests, and that the outcome would be smarter and better than what any individual or top-down totalitarian system could come up with. So we generate an invisible hand. And whether or not this is even a good idea, there are obviously several huge data sets that get alienated or excluded from this form of social AI. We don't have to go through all of them. For me, the most prominent problematic one is that, like, most labor and most ecology is not priced into this system. We don't pay moms or students. You don't get money for meditating or staying hydrated. The tree, before it gets cut down, is not priced into the market. So the results of our social AI are at best highly distorted and misincentivized because they don't play with a full set of numerical inputs. So that's where I generally come at this from. What are you guys thinking when it comes to economic alienation in the form of externalities?
No, you can't do that after I did the whole time. But should I pick it up, brother? You pick it up. You pick it up. I'll go after you.
You could do it quickly and hand it to me if you wanted to. But
Okay. Just says so. Let's go back a step, right? So when Adam Smith, right, describes this invisible hand, we emphasize his Wealth of Nations book, but we ignore his Moral Sentiments book. Right, his book that he wrote before, which is essentially, rooted, as David Graeber points out, in Islamic mysticism, right, meaning in a larger field of value. And essentially what we did is, and I'll just give a word on it just to kind of, pass it to Z, and maybe I'll comment afterwards. But in a word, there's a very beautiful phrase that lives throughout the Aramaic texts in the, 3rd century, which is called Galuta de Shchinta, the exile of the Shekhinah. And the Shekhinah is the goddess, but is Eros. But if you read the sources carefully, it's and I was privileged to write a couple of volumes called Radical Kabbalah, which look at these lineages. And one of the things I tried to point out there was that in the Solomon lineage, the kind of radical Eros of the goddess and the Eros of justice and value merged together. That there was no split between them, that actually it was always about Eros value. So the exile of the Shekhinah is the exile of Eros value. So we exiled Eros value into 2 places, right? 1 into sexuality, right? We exiled Eros into the sexual, and 2 is into economics, right? Those are the 2 places we actually exiled, right, this quality of Eros value, and we actually moved to a world in which the word value literally meant that which was commodified and measurable in a particular way. And it's literally an example of the exile of the Shekhinah, where we literally exiled the entire field of value into this very, very limited form of value, right? Which is not without value, but it's extremely, extremely limited. And we said that is what value means, quite literally. And so when you actually, I asked, when Chat GPT-3 was kind of in the beginning, I did a one mountain where we asked Chat GPT-3, and then we did it again with Chat GPT-4, right? A bunch of questions about value. And of course, the overwhelming response was that real value is economic valuation. And that other thing that people refer to as value is either not real or constructed. There's a few religious people who still say that that's real, but basically that's not real, which means that ChatGPT-4 was abstracting, from all of the inputs to what culture believes about this. So this is just a stunning example of the exile of the Shekhinah. And to liberate the Shekhinah is to actually reclaim the field of value and to locate the economic, or what the sources call the shuk, the marketplace, in the larger field of value. So that just maybe opens it up, Z. I'll pass to you.
Yeah, no, that's right. When you think of value theory, mostly in the academy, they're talking about economics, they're talking about things of that nature. And it is a very important way to clarify with people, even beginning this conversation, like, how much is it worth? How much is a tree worth? How much is a person worth? These questions are different. And yet the global economy does answer the question, how much a person is worth and how much a tree is worth. And we're comfortable with the idea that a tree is a price tag, but putting a price tag on a person was not something we explicitly talk about, even though it's done all the time. Basically, the constant system basically runs. So there's the distortion and the truncation and the forced negligence and kind of, again, blindness around what's actually occurring with certain dimensions of economics, kind of making it so that we have a very weird and distorted sense of value. So, for example, fungibility is a big deal of value. So money is basically fungible value tokens, basically, right? So what that means is, like, you can take the value that's instantiated as a tree and get it into something that's some abstract thing that allows you to get the value that's in something else that's not like a tree at all, right? And that's a super weird idea. Like in nature, let's say, like in nature, all of the value is non-fungible, and this gets to uniqueness. Uniqueness is non-fungible, right? Dollars are, even though technically each dollar bill is unique, what they're going for there is something that's perfectly interchangeable with something else that still reserves the value that's abstractly instantiated, right? So it's a pretty complicated thing the more you think about it, and it is about getting value out of instantiation and into this abstract representation where the uniqueness and fungibility of value disappears, and then you can aggregate it in grotesque ways. And so I would argue that, yes, there was Adam Smith, and we've talked a lot about markets, but that thing never really happened. Like, if you really want a market, you have to go way back in time. Like, when the thing we call capitalism emerged, it is almost by definition the capture of markets in order to maximize profit as the function of the market, rather than to maximize commodity exchange and the wealth of a nation, right? The wealth of a nation is not abstract, fictitious capital. The wealth of a nation is the actual wealth of a nation, which would mean it's actual goods and material assets, and they call material capital with buildings, infrastructure, stuff like that.
Spiritual capital.
Spiritual, that's different. Now I'm talking about capital, meaning money, not all of the other nations. I'm saying capitalism is about money. It's specifically not about those other things. And capitalism isn't about markets or free markets, or about markets as signaling. Like, that should be great, but it's not. It's about consolidation of power in order to get returns on that power, in order to maximize profit, which is different than creating a market where we actually get information in terms of exchange, in terms of what's wanted and what's produced, which would require symmetry in knowledge between producer and consumer, which means you're not really advertising, which of course that ship sailed a long time ago. So advertising, I believe, is one of the places where the distortion of the perception of value occurs more profoundly than anywhere else. It is by design, the distortion of the perception of value and the truncation of value into economic terms. And so, yeah, there's a long conversation about how our current existing economic system, which isn't a free market and now isn't really no longer capitalism. That's why we're talking about techno-feudalism. The signaling mechanisms within it are completely distorted. That's why it's about to die, because it's not actually in touch with reality. It's in touch with some fiction where value is fungible. So there's that. It's distorted, but it's also distorting our ability to perceive value. And I would think primarily because of advertising and because of economic demoralization. Like if you don't have money, then you have no choice but to make money the most valuable thing in your life, because it's the thing that mediates your access to food and water. Full stop. But that's also weird. In nature, animals don't have usually other animals mediating their access to food and water by means of some abstract fungible thing that you exchange. Like in nature, you have almost universally, unconditionally, individually unmediated access to the source of what you need to survive biologically, food and water. And more specifically, the mothers, the ones who raise the young ones, have the ability to get the young ones what they need without the intermediary of a politically instantiated social relation that involves this abstract currency. So the cutting of the natural relationship of our access to value is intense. Puts us out of nature and into a different type of situation, which how could we possibly perceive what's actually valuable when our backs are against the wall this way, literally, and not by a system that gets us in touch with what we need and what the market can produce and creates enough for everybody. That's not the market we're in. We're in one that's exploiting us, that's attempting to extract as much as possible and give as little as possible and bring as much as possible to an increasingly small number of people. And we all know that that's happening. Or many people know that it's happening. Some think it's good, something that's how it's supposed to work. Others think it's terrible, but they have no choice but to participate in it. And so that complicates the conversation about it. So the forced hypocrisy and obligate sociopathy of participating in this economic system also distorts our ability to perceive value.
Let's maybe we'll just add one addendum and pass back to you for the last few pieces, Layman, because this is just so important. Let's just go back to kind of a core definition of value. And one of the things that David's been working with in the last few weeks, actually yesterday, he just did a couple of hours of just trying to write down. There was an earlier version this week, but it was another one yesterday with kind of like, we actually wrote down 30 different definitions of value, which all are inter-included. They're all different ways of saying pretty much the same thing. But let me just give you one of them, which already appears in the writings and appears in future writings as well, and which is very, very helpful in this conversation. So clarified need discloses value. Clarified desire discloses value. Sentence 2. Sentence 3, clarified need and clarified desire disclose clarified value. Sentence 3, right? Sentence 4, just another way of saying it, evolution is eros in action in response to need. Or evolution is eros in action in response to desire. So need and desire disclose value is one of the core structural sentences in cosmogonic humanism and key to a world religion. Now, what happens is in the current economic system and in the system of capitalism, with one of its expressions being advertising, is precisely the distortion of need and desire. That's the operative system, is we're going to distort your access to clarified need and desire. So if the movement of cosmos as a value is a movement towards transformation, transformation is a clarification which allows for a new emergence, So the clarification of desire, Beirur is what Luria called it, right, as this fundamental movement in cosmos. Then you have a cosmos that then begins to mistakenly see itself or experience itself outside the field of value because it's caricatured value as this kind of pre-modern architectonic, which clearly doesn't hold. And the critiques of pre-modern value are actually real, right, and need to be taken into account, right? But therefore, we begin to experience ourselves as outside the field of value. And then what then fills that vacuum is a set of systems which are denuded stories, distorted stories, which by their very nature generate systems which block our capacity, right, to clarify need and to clarify desire. Right. So that's wild. So I'll just give you one example and then close this because I think we've addressed it. But how many people in the year, I don't know, 2000, right, woke up and said, "Oh my God, I desperately need Facebook. I'm desperate. I can't live without Facebook." Or I desperately need, how many people woke up, a decade ago, "I can't live without TikTok. Can't be. I've got this visceral need and desire for TikTok." Well, no. So actually what happened is, right, there was a generation of a need and a desire, which then kicked in a set of economic principles, which basically said you have to participate. We're actually imposing, right, based on our asymmetric power, right, a need and desire, which you have to actually align with, without which you're actually isolated, right, and somehow undermined in your core integrity. Well, that's shocking, right? So that the entire description of the world that Adam Smith was in any sense describing has nothing to do with that. Whatever we think about the Adam Smith system, it didn't take this possibility into account at all. It just didn't exist. So we need to return to a capacity to access, right, my clarified need and desire. More to say, but that's enough to kind of complete that thought. Great.
Yeah, I don't know, it's such a fascinatingly rich area around economy and numbers because we can't really tell a story about what's going on in the world with people's needs and desires to some extent unless we convert those into the numbers needed to socially tell that story. Right now, we're getting the numbers through an asymmetrically informed negotiation between people who are pressured by surplus and scarcity. But like, what is David J. Temple as economist? How do we clarify need and desire through numbers so that it can be entered into the sort of collective system that we're running on this planet?
I mean, I know, I know David was very interested in my 13 social miracles. That was one of the, when that book came out, David was excited by some of the basic ideas of the 13 social miracles. And some of the things that are in there just have to do with a basic reboot of the economic system as being requisite. And a lot of that has to do with the insanity of the debt that's involved. And what's interesting in Graeber's book about debt is the stories he tells about debt's origin in a moral relationship rather than a quantitative relationship. Meaning that debt cannot not, meaning it has to be understood in some sense as a relationship of value. So, right. So you have student loans. Well, you're from Canada, so you probably don't have student loan debts. But those who have student loan debts in the United States who've been preyed upon and put in no other position in order to further their education, but to get these loans, feel now somehow less valuable, somehow shamed by the fact that they live with debt. Because to be in debt is to be somehow you've made a mistake if you're in debt. Like if you're in debt, you're somehow, that's a bad position to be in, is to be in debt. Now, if you're super rich, it's actually another, you just took a bunch of venture capital, but that's not considered debt. That's like awesome or something. But like when you're not super rich, there's this sense that debt is this shameful thing to have, even though the society puts you in a position to have it to join the society. And this is how it feels to be in the student debt crisis in the United States. And so that's very key. And that was part of the debt jubilee that was proposed in the social miracles. That was part of this way to get out of this structure into some new structure. Because you could talk about some new structure, but well, here we are, and it's not just going to magically appear. So you actually kind of have to talk a little bit first about how to mitigate the harms of this one and get the hell out of it. And so, yeah, the first thing would be that it would be some kind of debt jubilee. And of course, there would also be very strong dimension of not basic income in the simple, demoralizing nightmare that reifies one's dependence upon a totalitarian state or something like that. So not that basic income, but some complex, flexible social safety net that makes use of the kind of like surplus of our cooperative activity. Let's put it that. Right now, the surplus of our cooperative activity is siphoned off. Well, it's directed and siphoned off by a small number of people. You could imagine that the surplus of the cooperative activity, which is pretty big, but not as big as the speculative, fictitious capital makes it out to be, but there's still a surplus of our cooperative activity, that could be somehow justly distributed. So now you're back to the actual signaling system of a commodity supply chain coupled to some type of exchange infrastructure that would allow for the distribution of wealth, basically. And that's when we think about what an economic system is. It's not the extraction of wealth and the hoarding of wealth. It should be about the distribution of wealth. And people hear that term, they think giving money away. But in fact, that's not what it means. It means, averting famines and averting the meltdown of currencies and assuring that the wealth is not hoardable. In fact, that the wealth moves, which there are models for in prior systems. So I think we need to somehow think very, very deeply about the inhumanity of the current system to have enough political will to create a system that would be, and again, the social miracles are described as social miracles because the types of actions that would be necessary to have an economy that would stay within planetary boundaries and be humane, which are not the same thing. You could totally make it an ecological totalitarian nightmare that would stay within planetary boundaries. A humane civilization within planetary boundaries, that's not, we're not on course for that. And a big part of that is the inhumanity of the existing system, the intensity of the change required to get us into an economic situation that would be humane requires us first to see how bad it really is right now, in terms of not like that it's precarious and we're all going to lose money in investments. That's not what it means to say the economy is bad. This is a moral condemnation of the economy of the economy, which means it's bad even when it's succeeding. By that other definitions, it's bad, maybe specifically, especially when, maybe not, but it's hard to know, due to the inextricable relationships of exploitation that are now written into the basic laws of the economic system. So I don't know how we got started about critical economics and heterodox economics, but it's an important part of the reorientation of all discourses around the re-ontologizing of value. And economics is one of the places where it has to start, but many, many, many of the existing fields are kind of not serious enough about the ontological realities that they're operating on. Right? So if economics is about wealth and extraction and commodity production and exchange, how can we have an economic system that's about to destroy the whole planet, which ends the game of economics? Like this thing is wrong, right? And likewise with other fields like medicine, law, and so it's a little bit.
But none of that work can be done without a field of value. And that's the thing, right? In other words, without locating ourselves in a field of value, none of that can be done. So take, for example, a word like money, right? Money. So the original word for money is kesef, K-E-S-E-F. And kesef comes from the term nichsefa nafshi, my heart yearns. It's my longing, my yearning. So the very word money, and it's kind of the original Semitic, form in the interior sciences, is yearning. What do I yearn for? Now, the dissociation between how commodification happens today and what I yearn for is obviously intense, right? Another example of kind of this exile of eros value. Now, in order to kind of be able to then re-ontologize, right, a field of value or disclose the ontology of the field of value, which then infuses economics, what we have to do is we have to take, and this is one of the things that David J. Temple kind of pointed out, we have to take this set of texts that I've tried to put together called the tenets of intimacy and bring them together with a set of texts that Zach's tried to put together called the social miracles. And the tenets of intimacy need to meet the social miracles, meaning the social miracles only work if they're based on tenets of intimacy, meaning actual structures of the field of value, right? That actually
otherwise they're miracles. The idea would be that
right.
They appear to be miracles because we think the universe
That's right.
But in fact, if evolution and therefore humans are this way, they're actually not miracles.
That's right. Precisely. In other words, a miracle is the correct placing of attention, mirari. Miracle comes from the word mirari, and I've placed my attention in a correct way to actually disclose the nature of the field of value in which we operate. And paradoxically, right, if we don't do that, then value itself, which is reality, right, self-terminates, right? That's its nature, because it can't not do that, because we're actually violating, right, its essential structure. Now, if you just think for a second, you have to always go back to kind of three core questions, and you can't avoid them. We call these the three great questions of cosmorotic humanism. And the questions are very much like the interior version of what Turing in Morphogenesis 4748 at Bell Lab describes as simple first rules, which allow you to iterate coherent complexity. And those are answers to the most simple questions, because you need simple first rules. And the simple questions are: where am I, where are we? Who am I, who are we? And then what ought be done? Right? What ought be done? Right? What should be done? Now, or what is the irreducible rightness, right, of reality that wants to be enacted in some way? Now, if I actually get where, meaning I live in a cosmorotic universe, not as a metaphor, not as a mythopoetic idea, but actually the cosmorotic universe is the field of eros value. And Layman, I would say one of the most important things that we've done in the last couple of years, to the extent that anything is important and everything is important, right, is we've refused to use the word eros separately from the word value. Right? And so I don't want to go down that road now, but if you look at the eros equation, eros equals the experience of radical aliveness, desiring ever deeper contact and ever greater wholeness, right? That's a description of eros value. That's a description in which eros and ethics are one. Right, we're moving towards deeper contact and greater wholeness, which is a right relationship between parts. So in this field of eros value, I realize I live in the field of eros value. That's one. So that's where I am. I'm in an intimate universe, right? I live in an intimate universe. The intimate universe lives in me. But two, who am I? I am a unique expression of that intimate universe, and I am in an, Bucky Fuller's phrase, an omni-responsible relationship to the whole. Right, I can't be coherent unless I'm omnicoherent with the whole. Right, I can't feel unless I can, in some sense, feel the whole. And that notion of feeling the whole was an educational principle. So when I get that, not an abstract principle, it was a core educational principle, so that I actually train the initiate. When an initiate does an action, we train the initiate to say, this action, this individual local action which I take, actually affects, shapes the field. I'm participatory in the field, and therefore I impact on the field, and I feel power moving through me, which is a particular quality, an elixir of reality, not pathological power, but the power of reality that moves through me, which gives me the capacity to impact the whole, even if I have no formal public political power over, right, of the commodified form. So I actually realize that I'm intimate with the field, and I can actually affect and shape the field, right? So I have this wider sense of intimacy. Now, if I then leave people out of the field of value, and they experience profound suffering, right, that directly affects my interiority. I can't look away, right? We actually share identity, right? There is no one outside of the circle. And maybe just to say it this way, I remember a kind of, fierce argument we had with a wonderful colleague. I won't say their name, but who's a kind of a prominent scientist and a beautiful man, and he said, well, love can't be real, value can't be real, because there's always an in-group and an out-group, and the in-group always kills the out-group, right? And he basically wrote a well-known book about this. So we said to him, yes, that's true. I said to him, but actually there's always an in-group. There's never not been an in-group, and everyone agrees that within the in-group, you actually have to act with a kind of intimate coherence and ethos. So the issue is not, is eros value real? The issue is, where do you place your boundary, right? Do you expand your circle? So you got to move the boundary, right? So that moving the boundary can be done, right? We can actually, I can actually widen the story that I live in. And maybe as we're finishing, we're moving towards conclusion now, the end is in the beginning and the beginning is in the end, which is a text from that original book we quoted earlier, the Book of Creation. And a good conversation, we come back at the end to that which is in the beginning, because the intimate universe is weaving that coherence. So what we need to do is we need to expand the story. I'm not living in a narrow story, a separate self story, which I'm only concerned with a very, very narrow circle of players. I'm actually living in a wider story, right? I'm willing to die for the nation. That's a wider story. Now it can become perverse. So I need to expand. No. I'm willing to actually die for the world, and therefore live for the world. Okay, not just the world now, maybe now past, present, and future. Okay, now let's get cosmological value, right? Let's get beyond the avatar and the Marine sergeant or colonel. Let's actually create a shared cosmological feeling of value, so that we're not just in the Star Trek Federation where we're doing non-interference, right? We actually have a coherent value that's emergent in the universe, right? So I'm expanding my identity. I'm expanding my answer to who. Now, when I've expanded my answer to who, that completely affects my what. Now, the what I ought to do is how I construct in economics, right, is directly related to my where and to my who. And that brings together tenets of intimacy with actually a reorganization, right, a reinstantiation, right, of the lived world. And it's that basic, and it's that exciting, and it's that privileged, and it's that terrifying.
I like the phrase "I can't look away" as a kind of concise articulation of an expanding ethic for a distributed morphogenetic responsibility for the field. I want to bring the conversation right up to date, because we've got this sort of kind of historical story we've been talking about, where uh, we've got obligate sociopathy and forms of alienation embedded in extractive capitalism's enslavement of the egregore of the market into a fungible liquidity whose surpluses are directed by a tiny non-representative minority. But to some degree, that's being replaced by the emergence of the techno-feudalism you guys are talking about. So what are the techno-feudalists, as they emerged, uniquely alienating us from? Is it ownership of our data? Is it our free attention? Is it the definition of ourself relative to their simplified profiling parameters? What does techno-feudalism alienate us from?
I think we say we foreshadow the techno-feudalist book, which David is furiously working on now.
Number 41. It's proposition 41.
Correct. Where I believe we say that it is the death of our humanity. It's not whether they're taking everything from us, is one way to think about it. So it is an existential risk. It is not a catastrophic risk or a wicked problem. Right. It is a threat to the species, not because it will end all biological life, but because it will take from us access to the ability to intergenerationally transmit the species-specific traits that have conferred upon us sapience, which means basically the long duration joint attentional situations where we engage in the cultivation of valueception. and identity. And so the emergence of first the curational ability to capture attention and actually destroy the attentional system through hyperstimulation and algorithmic customization of stimuli and behaviorist skin area and reinforcements that trap people into an inescapable downward spiral of attentional system neurological degeneration. That's the first wave. And we didn't do well with that. Remember, we didn't like stop that thing. Actually, we haven't stopped that thing, even though we've had like the social dilemma, and we've had Congress conferring, and Mark Zuckerberg stood up and like apologized to people in front of Congress. But we haven't actually stopped the kids from being preyed upon by the techno-feudalists and having not their beliefs messed with. That's secondary to the attentional system itself at a neurological level being captured by the technology. And then you get generative AI, which now is imposing a stance of teacherly authority. Before, the algorithm gave you the productions of other humans who claimed to be saying things that were true or not. Now the computer is being designed to appear to be a truth-speaking, language-using creature. That begins to run a different, much deeper interference on our ability to do this whole being human thing, right? It was already hard to do because we can't pay attention to each other anymore because our brains got broken. But now we're so confused about what personhood is that we give teacherly authority to a generative AI system. And that over time will become a humanoid embedded robotics in the domestic economy and ecology of sensors to just be a socialization technology. Artificial intelligence driven socialization technology, which will basically obsolete human relationship. And then we have a generation of kids who are raised by machines and not raised by humans. That is a speciation event.
Yeah.
So that's like a long argument. We don't tell that whole story in that book, but that's the story that we're telling, which is that they're taking everything, right? It was like the capitalists stole from us time and health and a whole bunch of other things. And over the long arc, they're taking away the environment and a whole bunch of other things. And of course, it's not just capitalism, because that never, well, what does that mean? Did that really exist? Anyway, but it's another question. But now we're in a situation techno-feudalists are actually transhumanists, which means they are by design attempting to evacuate us from the biological. So the capitalists evacuated us from the feudal, which was, like pluses and minuses, if you will, dignities and disasters of modernity. The transhumanists, techno-feudalists, are seeking to evacuate us from the biological as such. So that's a very different thing. And the advanced technologies that they're playing with are very different than the ones that occurred the last time we had this level of civilizational transvaluation. So yeah, they're taking everything from us insofar as we understand everything. Now they claim to be giving us something else. And if you've read Bostrom's Deep Utopia or other views about what they're claiming to be giving us, it's actually an insane fantasy. So my sense is that, yeah, they're everything, they're gambling everything. So yeah, that's why David is frantically sending notes and freaking out, trying to get these books out. And it's not clear how to talk those transhumanists out of trying to get everyone to upload their brains into robots that can leave the planet and colonize the universe.
I mean, maybe, and this is, as again, as we look to kind of create a kind of bookend so we can kind of feel the wholeness of the conversation, and we've been at David's urging, David basically kind of wrote us a note and said, you guys aren't technologists, but we really want you to write about technology as an example of the failure of the field of value. So in some sense, this techno-feudalism book, which is, quite a large tome, it's quite a serious engagement, right, is an example of the value conversation. It's an instantiation of the value conversation. And the Industrial Revolution kind of destroyed the substrate, right, of both the planet, right, an extraction model where we're kind of crossing planetary boundaries, but also generated this explosion of population, but together with it, an explosion of suffering. Dignities and disasters of modernity, as Zach referred to Habermas, right? An explosion of suffering, just simply knowing there's that many more humans and the percentage of them that's suffering means there's actually objectively also more suffering. So there's an explosion of life, an explosion of suffering. The infotech revolution, right, with the infotech and then nanotech, et cetera, right, is the defacing of the very face of humanity, right? And that's this distinction that Zach was referring to, that David talks about, the difference between the death of humanity and the death of our humanity. And so maybe in conclusion, just to point to one thing that Zach was alluding to, and David kind of insisted a couple of months ago, just somewhat annoyingly, I might say, right, that we actually take some time off and write, knock out 100,000 words, which we did, on attention itself. Because one of the things that we point out in the first book, right, is that there's this great crying out at the great violations of the attention economy, and people, writers like Zuboff and 10 others, right, all kind of make this great hue and cry. How can we be stealing our attention? The only problem is they fail to establish why that's a problem, right? So they'll revert to kind of citing Sartre and being a nothingness, right, as evidence of this being a problem, when in fact what Sartre is saying in Being a Nothingness, and you look at the exact passages, but you get a sense of Sartre is the apostle of cosmic meaninglessness, right? Who essentially is saying there is no field of value, and therefore the definition of responsibility is to realize there's no field of value and that you're making it all up. And so when Zuboff kind of wants to kind of stay kosher with Pinker, who himself, if you read Pinker carefully, right, he kind of comes close to recognizing a field of value in multiple passages, and then he runs away from it because he just won't do it, right? And but really we're making that, it looks like, but really we're making this up, right? It's all made up. There is no field of value. So then there's no way to basically object to techno-feudalism because you have no ground for your objection. And in about 10 passages in Zuboff, she defines her mission as naming, right, the moral imperative, naming the structures of, what she called surveillance capitalism. We call techno-feudalism for a bunch of reasons, right? Because surveillance, the way she uses surveillance is actually problematic, but bracket that. And then in about 10 other passages, she uses the phrase, and my purpose is to arouse astonishment and outrage. That's her phrase, which will then cause, right, the arousal of some kind of will, which will then change the vector of history. The only problem is that will is connected to value, right? And it's the violation of value arouses will. If you've basically effaced the field, there's no field of value, and you haven't identified attention itself as a first principle and first value, and you haven't shown that to be true, right, as a kind of structure of cosmos, well, then what's the problem with hijacking attention? And we had I had a recent conversation with a well-known, and beautiful human being, kind of captain of capitalist endeavors, right, in beautiful expressions of conscious capitalism, right, who basically said, "What's the problem? What's the problem? There's no problem here. It's the same thing that's always been, right? You steal some people's attention in order to advertise and sell, and that's just the way the market works." Well, no. There's 10 reasons why that's not true. But besides the structural reasons why it's not true, we have to do something much deeper. We have to actually establish that attention forms identity, right? That attention is a quality of eros, that attention generates reality, that attention is a first principle and first value of cosmos. And I actually have a right to my attention because a right is rooted in a value. And so we spent a whole book on actually rights and values, right, that David kind of very quickly dictated to us, which is which is going to come out right after techno-feudalism, because it's part 2, because you can't have the conversation one without the other. And so it's all part of, right, this very, very, and maybe for me, last sentence, right, none of this is an intellectual exercise. All of this would need to be done if there was no meta crisis, because that's part of the evolution of value and part of the evolution of love. But it could be done at a more leisurely pace with more kind of, just delight and wonder. And now we have to do it both with delight and wonder at the privilege, but also with a sense of very, very profound urgency, right? That is to say, can we plant seeds in the ground which will allow us to ameliorate suffering, right? But more than ameliorate suffering, can we actually avoid the death of our humanity, right? Or the death of humanity? So the stakes couldn't be more serious like that.
That's got a nice kind of concluding ring to it, and we're near the end of looking at this initial set of alienations that you guys have provided in this book. But while I've got you here, I want to throw in one more thing, which is not in the book really. But what about alienation from actual aliens? Although maybe the word actual isn't quite
Great.
appropriate, but how does cosmorotic humanism stand in relation to potential other cosmic intelligences whose presence we've alienated through a marginalizing public consensus and parapolitical manipulations, or maybe some quality of the human mind that rejects them? How do you guys think about mutual sense making and intimacy with ultra terrestrials, crypto terrestrials, interdimensional others, or any other kind of sapience that's in relationship to the human species?
I should note, and this time I'm gonna Zach will conclude. I should note that you're assuming that we're both Earth beings, so I don't want to go there right now, but we'll just leave that as an assumption on the table for now, which is certainly not at all clear. But I got
Marc
you.
Gafni pulls off his human mask at the last moment of the video.
There we go. Yeah, no, I actually forgot. Actually, as you said that, I forgot how a funny, humorous comment could be distorted, right? But no, but I am not a Palladian. But let's not go further down that rabbit hole. But let me say something, serious, which is the when we're talking about value, we're precisely talking about a cosmological field of value. And that this is extremely important. We're not talking about global value, meaning Earth value. We're talking about value, which is the structure of reality. It's the structure of the cosmos, right? And, whether the cosmos is a verse or a multiverse, right? It's the structure of reality itself, right? And the question is the given reality of multiple intelligences in the cosmos, which is, we're not going to go down that road, but there's an enormous amount of information, as we all know, right? Both, kind of, within the kind of, scientific modern evidentiary context, which our friend Sean has done so much work on, right? And many others, right, have done, very, very important work on, but also within the lineages, it's a given, right? It's an absolute, given, right? So to actually suggest at this moment in time that there is no other intelligence that kind of lives in cosmos, right, is just an empirical absurdity, right? And anyone who's looked at the literature with any kind of seriousness, kind of knows that that's true, right? Now the question is, do we become human centric, as in kind of an Avatar movie, which is an example of kind of archetypes of human centrism, or do we actually articulate? And that's why the work of David J. Temple is not about peace on earth, as it were, right? It's about how do we actually enact together the next emergence of the cosmos. And so David, right, experiences, right, her work, right, as in that sense, very profoundly what Abraham Cook calls the song of the cosmos. It's not the song of the individual. It's not the song of the nation. It's not the song of the world. It's what Cook calls in his fourfold song, the song of the cosmos. We have to articulate the song of the cosmos, and the cosmos is value laden, right? Value is not hard to find. Value is impossible to avoid. And just as mathematical value moves throughout the cosmos, right, and all of the universes, so interior value moves throughout, right? And that's why we're welcome in the universe. And that's the beginning of any conversation in this conversational cosmos, right? It's a conversational cosmos, and a conversational cosmos implies shared value, because that's how a conversation happens. So that's enormously exciting, right? And trepidatious, and the nature of this moment. Dr.
That's
Stein.
exactly what I would expect a Pleiadian to say.
Right.
Uh, I mean, my flippant answer is that the popular culture kind of portrayal of the take me to your leader first speech act that is uttered would require us to have leaders. And so my sense is that we may be, in fact, waiting. They may be, in fact, waiting. We may be waiting for contact because they are waiting for someone to speak to, actually. And absent a field of value means absent any type of possibility for planetary legal infrastructure, means absent any possibility of global sovereign, not a global hegemon, but global sovereign, meaning leader, meaning we are not a disordered Tower of Babel, endlessly warring with ourselves species, which means when he comes taking me to your leader, you're like, who would that be? And this isn't a joke about how like some specific leader. This is just about show me the leaders. The aliens come down, they're like, where are the adults? Or whatever. And there's a maturational process that would definitely be required for us to be explicitly talked to. Because right now we are not probably perceived as being the kinds of beings who can be reasoned with. That would be my guess, given our current situation of like planetary scale suicidal thing. So I hope that they're kind of what's called crisis advocates. That's what they call people who talk people out of suicide. Crisis advocates, which means you come in with the attitude of like, awesome, you're in this crisis. Perfect. We're brought to the point where you are in this crisis. I'm a crisis advocate. I'm not trying to stop this crisis. I'm trying to make this crisis actually change you enough that we could actually bring you into this other dimension / possibility of agency, which has been foretold. Again, I'm more of a religious transhumanist in a rabbinic or Desjardinian sense than I would be a scientific or techno-optimist transhumanist. So I'm not convinced these things are that have built physical spaceships that move through light years of physical space. That's not clear to me at all. But it is clear to me that they don't have anyone they can explicitly talk to, and certainly don't want to talk to all of us. Meaning, how could you talk to all of us who don't have a leader? Who would they listen to? Oprah? Or whoever. So to me, that's it. It's like, yeah, of course. Like if they're there, they have no way to be taken seriously. They have no way to be taken seriously because we're not even taking ourselves seriously. We're not even seriously looking at the fact we're all about that. They may be the only ones taking seriously the fact that we have the technologies that could. The hottest thing in the known universe is of whatever we created in the Hadron Collider. Like mathematically, you can't actually detect it, but that's And so it's like, okay, we're up to some serious business down here. And yet we have no leader. We have no possibility for planetary sovereign world dominion of righteous legal structure. Seems impossible. And so therefore, there's no joining any kind of transplanetary federation. You guys don't even really have a planet to speak of. And this is Aurobindo's view, essentially. He was like, yeah, there's this period of planetization where there's a race between heaven and hell, and you make it, in which case you join this whole other thing that he didn't know even what to think about, or you don't. In which case the Kali Yuga ends this thing permanently, as opposed to the Kali Yuga booting the next one, which has a whole new cast of value instantiations and avatars of intelligence, being, consciousness, bliss, reincarnated, something like that. So I don't know if that's the kind of thing you're looking to end the podcast on, but those would be my flippant, somewhat dismissive thoughts about it. Yeah.
We will, just to say, we will wait for you.
Yeah, my other response would be like, help us, hurry up and help us, or please.
Any other things you guys want to add in terms of influencing the aftertaste of people who've watched these two interviews? Or feel good, feel like we're done? How's this sitting with you?
I just invite people to read, right, and really
Yeah,
to
I
engage.
was gonna say.
Right? In other words, in other words, the books are written with great care. We refuse to put out a new one. We wrote two or three books that we're now only in 2015, 2018, we're only going to put out now. But this is the first thing, we spend 12, 13 years before putting out, just to get that sense, before putting out this first piece, and, you know, tens of thousands of hours of kind of being deep inside of it. So the book is, and I just want to say this tenderly, but somewhat fiercely, right? The book is worth reading line by line, and then find us, and you think we missed something, right? You think there's something to add. You think there's a set of sources we should be looking at, right? So participate. Participate in David J. Temple. Kind of participate in the conversation in some, real and genuine way. And the project is ongoing, right? The Great Library Project is we spend 12 years kind of under the radar, and now we're going to go even deeper inside to try and really articulate these next pieces. And just if we could feel the joy of it and the urgency, and somehow move beyond the pettinesses, right, and actually, meet each other in the celebration and urgency of this moment, right, we would have a much better chance of making contact with all of those larger intelligences. And so just deep, 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 deep radical audacity, but just even more profound, genuine humility and invitation.
Nice. I
Yeah.
appreciate how much um, information processing and depth orientation and concern and also play that you guys are both bringing to this project. So,
Yeah.
thanks for talking to us about
Thank you,
Thank
Layman.
you.
it.
Okay.